You're watching the Everything Network. By the mid-20th century, New York City's underworld had organized itself into something resembling a shadow government. 5 elite mafia families, 5 empires, each ruled by hierarchy, loyalty, and silent calculation. Among them, the Gambino crime family stood at the top. It was the wealthiest, most structured, and, for decades, the most feared. Its story was one of expansion, betrayal, and survival, told not only through its flamboyant figures, but through men who operated in silence. Among those was Louis Vallario, a soldier, then captain, later consigliere, who would navigate the rise and fall of the family from the inside, remaining a constant presence through decades of upheaval. Louis Vallario was born in 1942 in New York City, raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Staten Island, where organized crime was part of the fabric of daily life. In his youth, the Gambino family was under the control of Carlo Gambino, the family's namesake. Gambino was an old-world don, subtle and disciplined. He avoided attention and relied on diplomacy more than violence, favoring long-term stability over reckless ambition. His leadership defined a generation of mobsters who valued silence, restraint, and profit. During these years, Vallario grew up around men who lived by those rules. He entered the Gambino orbit through the Avenue U crew, a Brooklyn faction tied to future boss John Gotti and underboss Aniello Delacroce. The crew operated out of small storefronts and social clubs, managing gambling, bookmaking, and union rackets. Vallario's role, though modest at first, was marked by reliability. He earned quietly, without drawing attention. In a world where loud ambition could be fatal, that quality would serve him well. The Gambino family of the 1960s and 1970s was a machine of influence. It reached into longshoremen's unions, the garment district, construction sites, and trucking companies. Through intermediaries, it controlled labor contracts and extorted legitimate businesses, while maintaining the appearance of normal commerce. The family's power was built on discretion, and Delacroce, Carlo Gambino's underboss, was the model of that discipline. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, he passed the family to Paul Castellano, a decision that split the family's loyalties. Castellano was a businessman don, more comfortable with suits and ledgers than street crews. His focus on white-collar rackets alienated the traditional soldiers, particularly those aligned with Neil's faction in Queens and Brooklyn. Among that faction were John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, Joseph Armone, and Louis Vallario, men who had made their bones in the streets, not the boardroom. The divide widened as Castellano imposed stricter controls over drug dealing and personal spending. Delacroce, ever loyal to the old hierarchy, kept his men in line, but resentment simmered. When he died in December 1985, the balance collapsed. Within 2 weeks, Castellano and his bodyguard were gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, an execution that would change the course of organized crime in America. The Gotti era had begun. John Gotti's rise to power was unprecedented in its visibility. He became the first true celebrity boss, photographed in Brioni suits, smiling in tabloids, dubbed the Dapper Don by the press. His charisma electrified some and alarmed others. For older men like Louis Vallario, the attention was dangerous. But Vallario understood how to survive under any regime. During the late 1980s, he became part of Gotti's inner circle, alongside underboss Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, consigliere Frank Locascio, and top captains such as Peter Gotti and John Carneglia. Vallario's role was both operational and strategic, a liaison among crews, a man trusted to handle delicate financial arrangements and disputes. He was known as Big Lou, calm, deliberate, and respected. Unlike many of Gotti's associates, Vallario kept his profile low. He managed his interests in construction and labor racketeering, particularly through ties to the New York District Council of Carpenters and other union-linked enterprises. He also maintained influence over the Gambino-controlled concrete and trucking industries, a critical source of cash flow for the family. Inside Gotti's regime, power depended as much on demeanor as on muscle. Vallario's composure set him apart from the younger, more impulsive members. He became an intermediary figure, close enough to Gotti to be trusted, distant enough to avoid the fallout that consumed others. When the FBI began bugging Gotti's headquarters at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, Vallario's name surfaced frequently, not as a triggerman or provocateur, but as a key administrator, the kind of man who made the organization function. The 1990s brought federal retaliation. John, Sammy, and Frankie Locascio were indicted in 1991 for racketeering and murder. The government's evidence included recordings made inside the Ravenite Club, capturing Gotti discussing hits and internal politics. Gravano's subsequent decision to cooperate with authorities destroyed the Gotti myth and exposed the inner workings of the family. Vallario, though implicated in several investigations, avoided the catastrophic exposure that felled the leadership. While Gotti and Locascio were sentenced to life imprisonment in 1992, Vallario remained active. He became a captain, overseeing his own crew and helping to stabilize the organization during the transitional years. His survival reflected both prudence and trust. He had never sought headlines, and in the mob, anonymity was armor. By the mid-1990s, the Gambino family was struggling to redefine itself. With John Gotti incarcerated and his son John A. Gotti Jr. acting as boss, the hierarchy became fractured. Federal prosecutors targeted every level of the family's operations, from construction kickbacks to gambling rings. Louis Vallario was one of the few remaining senior figures from the old Gotti regime who still commanded respect. He was eventually elevated to consigliere, the family's senior advisor. In that role, Vallario functioned as the bridge between past and present, guiding younger captains while maintaining ties to older associates who had survived the turbulent Gotti years. His authority was quiet but enduring. Even as the family's income sources narrowed and its membership shrank, he maintained the structures of discipline that had once defined the Gambino name. Throughout the 1990s, Vallario's reputation grew as one of the last men of measure. He was not known for violence, but he understood its necessity. He was not loud, but his word carried force. In a world dominated by egos and betrayal, he was valued for steadiness. The FBI, however, never lost sight of him. In 2002, Vallario was indicted alongside several Gambino members for racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion linked to the family's control of construction projects across New York. The charges included extortion of contractors and kickback schemes that had generated millions in illicit revenue. Like many of his peers, Vallario faced the full weight of RICO statutes, laws designed specifically to dismantle organized crime hierarchies. At trial, prosecutors portrayed him as part of the family's governing body, a veteran who had helped sustain the Gambino structure after Gotti's imprisonment. They called him a trusted figure whose approval was required for major business ventures within the organization. Despite his low public profile, the evidence demonstrated his reach across multiple rackets. Vallario was convicted and sentenced to prison, marking the end of his decades-long run as one of the family's most stable figures. Even in confinement, Vallario remained respected. Among law enforcement circles, he was described as intelligent, pragmatic, and non-confrontational, a contrast to the volatile personalities that had dominated the headlines. He was released from federal custody in 2011 after serving his sentence, by which time the Gambino family had entered a quieter phase under newer leadership. The Gotti era was long over, but the structure that had carried the family through generations, captains, soldiers, and silent earners, still bore traces of the men who built it. Vallario's influence lingered in the discipline he maintained, the order he preserved when the family might have imploded. In the broader evolution of the mob, Vallario represented a bridge between two ages, the traditional Cosa Nostra of Carlo Gambino and the modern, media-exposed organization that John Gotti unintentionally created. He was not a showman, nor a revolutionary. He was an operator, one who understood that the true strength of the mafia was not in its violence, but in its ability to endure quietly. By the early 2000s, the Gambino family had diminished in size, but retained its core functions: gambling, loan sharking, construction, and trucking. New leaders, cautious and understated, learned from the mistakes of the Gotti years. The era of televised trials and tabloid headlines was over. The survivors returned to the shadows, rebuilding what they could in a changed world. Through all of it, Luis Vallario's legacy was subtle but profound. He had seen the rise of the celebrity mobster, the fall of entire hierarchies, and the transformation of organized crime into something smaller, more corporate, less mythic. Yet he had remained constant, a man whose career spanned from the quiet professionalism of Carlo Gambino to the chaos of the 21st century. He embodied the paradox of the mafia's endurance. Even as the organization collapsed under the weight of exposure and law enforcement, it adapted through men who refused to vanish completely. After the turn of the century, the Gambino crime family no longer resembled the empire that had ruled New York in the days of Carlo Gambino or John Gotti. Federal prosecutions, informants, and shifting economics had stripped the organization down to fragments of its former power. Yet, the structure persisted, tight, quiet, and still capable of influence in the city's construction, trucking, and gambling markets. When Luis Vallario completed his federal sentence in 2011, he returned to a world that was both familiar and unrecognizable. The neighborhoods that had once served as the family's heartbeat, Bensonhurst, Ozone Park, Howard Beach, and the docks of Staten Island, were gentrifying. The storefront clubs were gone or shuttered, replaced by cafes and condominiums. Surveillance technology made private conversation nearly impossible. What remained of the Gambino family operated under new restraint: small crews, tight communication, business conducted face-to-face only when necessary. For surviving figures like Vallario, this was the natural evolution of a trade that had learned too much from its own exposure. In the years immediately following his release, Vallario kept a deliberately low profile. Officially, he was retired. Unofficially, law enforcement agencies still regarded him as a senior counselor whose advice carried weight. His reputation for prudence made him a source of quiet stability. The new generation of Gambino leaders, those who had come of age after the Gotti spectacle, were shaped by that example. They preferred silence to fame, revenue to reputation. In many ways, Vallario's temperament became the blueprint for the family's survival strategy in the 21st century. The family's leadership after Gotti's death in 2002 drifted through several hands. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, assumed control briefly, but was imprisoned on racketeering charges. Arnold Squitieri, and later Nicholas Carozzo, attempted to maintain order, but each faced federal indictments. By the 2010s, the Gambinos had returned to something resembling the Carlo Gambino model: quiet governance through committees, smaller crews, and strict avoidance of media attention. It was a structure that men like Vallario had always favored: efficient, discreet, and cautious. Vallario's career had spanned nearly every major transformation of the American mafia. He had witnessed the Commission's consolidation in the 1950s, the labor racketeering dominance of the 1960s and 70s, the celebrity excess of the Gotti era, and the digital age collapse that followed. Through all of it, his own methods remained unchanged: patience, consistency, and a refusal to speak unnecessarily. In law enforcement circles, he was sometimes called the diplomat, a man who could resolve disputes without violence, whose word was trusted across borough lines. By the mid-2010s, federal interest in Vallario waned, Younger prosecutors focused on cybercrime, narcotics, and terrorism. Organized crime units still existed, but their targets were lower-level operators, sports betting rings, credit card fraud, and construction kickbacks that no longer approached the scale of the old days. The Gambinos remained under observation, yet the age of high-profile mob trials had passed. When Vallario's name appeared in reports, it was as a historical reference, a link to the era when the mafia still influenced the city's politics and unions. Behind the scenes, his influence endured in subtler ways. Several captains who had once served under him adopted his restrained management style. Meetings were infrequent and discreet. Money moved through legitimate businesses. The family's survival depended less on intimidation than on diversification, small-scale investments in waste management, real estate renovation, and logistics. The modern Gambino network looked more like a loose federation of businessmen than the violent brotherhood of earlier decades. The other families as a whole had followed a similar trajectory. The Bonanos were rebuilding after decades of informants and indictments. The Lucchesi and Colombos were operating at half strength, while the Genoveses had reverted to near invisibility. Among them, the Gambinos remained the most stable, thanks in part to the discipline that Vallario and others had instilled. The days of open warfare and flamboyant leadership were gone. Survival now meant professionalism. Louis Vallario's later life was largely private. He lived quietly, maintaining the careful habits of a man who had survived every stage of organized crime's evolution. For investigators who had studied the Gambinos for years, he was a symbol of endurance. Not the ruthless killer or public don, but the steady hand who kept the machinery turning long after the headlines had faded. In interviews, retired agents often pointed to Vallario as evidence that the mafia's real strength had always come from its administrators, not its icons. By the 2020s, New York's underworld bore little resemblance to the one Louis Vallario had joined half a century earlier. Technology, immigration, and federal power had fragmented the old structure. Street gambling had moved online, unions were heavily monitored, and cash businesses, once ideal for laundering, now operated under digital scrutiny. Yet traces of the old order persisted, informal networks of loyalty and shared history that linked surviving members across boroughs. These remnants owed much to the quiet influence of men like Vallario, who had taught that discretion was the last defense against extinction. In retrospect, his significance lies not in the crimes for which he was convicted, but in the continuity he represented. He bridged the understated rule of Carlo Gambino and the turbulent reign of John Gotti, then guided the family's return to silence. His presence illustrated how the mafia adapted. When violence drew too much attention, it shifted to business. When publicity threatened stability, it retreated underground. Through every cycle, men like Vallario ensured that the institution, however diminished, did not vanish completely. Historians of organized crime often describe the modern Gambino family as a relic sustained by habit and heritage rather than ambition. Yet within that continuity lies the legacy of the quiet operators. Vallario was one of them, disciplined, pragmatic, and loyal to a system that demanded endurance more than glory. His story, intertwined with the family's broader evolution, traces the path of American organized crime itself. From street corner rackets to boardroom extortion, from public spectacle to private survival. The Gambino family endures today as a fragment of its former self, reduced in size but still recognizable. It exists in the spaces between legality and loyalty, shaped by generations of men who refused to disappear. Among those names, Louis Vallario's stands as one of the last links to the structure that once governed New York's criminal world. He was the quiet strategist who understood that in the mafia, as in history, the loudest figures rarely last, but the careful ones do.